Hello and welcome to a new game from Chess.com's CCC 9 event, this time from the semifinals. Now, some of you requested me to review some games from the quarterfinals and from the qualification of this event, but I quite simply don't have the capacity to review these games. I wish I could, but I just simply can't, so I have to choose between them. And I intend to review some games from the semifinals, and then if I have the time, then go back and get the better ones from the quarterfinals and the qualification and maybe review those too. So this is now game 4 from the semifinals, and Komodo is handling the white pieces, and we have a King's Gambit Accepted, and here after f4 and e takes on f4, knight f3 and g5. In another game that I reviewed, Rosentreter played the h3, the more cautious h3, denying g4. But in this game, Komodo went for the wilder d4, and after g4 he played knight e5. And now we have queen h4 check, and after g3 and pawn takes, Komodo took on g4, and after they swapped queens, Leela now played knight c6. She would like to take here on d4 instead of the pawn on h2, but Komodo denied that now with c3. And if you look at this position, this looks really nice for white. He has a very strong center here, and this knight on g8 doesn't really have squares to go to, and this bishop on f8 also doesn't have good squares. So at first sight it looks like black's position is pretty grim, but luckily for him there is this move d5 which saves him. Black is now attacking this knight on g4, and this gives time to take this pawn on e4, and black is completely fine after that. If now Komodo would take this pawn on d5 to attack the knight, well, Leela could sack his knight on d4 since this one on g4 is also attacked, and after pawn takes on d4, bishop takes and h takes on g3, black's position is pretty good. These pawns here in the center are very good targets for the black pieces. For example, Leela could long castle here and immediately target those pawns. So that's why after d5, Komodo preferred to play knight e3, but this now allows d takes on e4, and after h takes on g3, Leela played here bishop d6, and her position is pretty good again. She has a target on g3. Komodo defended the pawn with the king, and now Leela played knight f6, and this is a nice position for the knight. It defends e4 and more importantly h7, allowing this rook to go to g8 and target this pawn on g3. And here Komodo could play maybe rook h6 to attack this knight, but after knight g4 check, knight takes, bishop takes, Leela would have a very strong threat with knight e7 and knight f5, attacking both the rook and the pawn on g3. So Komodo would need to pin that knight, but after castles the bishop would have to give himself up, and the resulting position is really good for black. He has the bishop pair and also has a passed pawn on e4, and white is behind in development. So that's why after knight f6, Komodo preferred to play here the developing knight d2. And now Leela targeted the pawn on g3, and this pawn is hard to defend. If white plays rook g1, then Leela can play h5, and this is just too passive for white. This pawn can't advance now without being lost, and Leela can pile up on the pawn on g3, and this is very good for her. So instead of rook g1, Komodo preferred to play actively and counterattack this pawn on e4. Leela now took the pawn on g3 with check, king e2, and now she pushed Harry up the board. Komodo took back the pawn on e4, knight takes, bishop takes, and now Leela played h4. And as a result of this opening, Leela is a pawn up, and the question is if white has compensation for it. Komodo here played knight f5, very good move, immediately attacking h4 and g3. And this knight is so strong that Leela had to take it out with the bishop, but now after bishop f5, Komodo has a very nice light square blockade thanks to this bishop. The game continued with knight d7, bishop h3, and now f5. Leela is pushing her pawns up the board, but can these pawns cross the light squares defended so nicely by that light squared bishop? Remember that Leela doesn't have a light squared bishop to fight for those squares. The game continued with bishop d2, f4, and now Komodo pushed the b pawn. He also has pawns, he wants to advance them. He has a 4-on-3 majority on the queen side, maybe he can create a passed pawn. Leela now played rook f8, trying to get in f3 check, but Komodo prevented that with rook f1, not only guarding the f3 square but also attacking this pawn on f4. And Leela would like to go up with her king to g5 and defend these pawns and maybe even help them to advance somehow. But playing king f7 now would lose this pawn on f4. So Leela played here rook f6, creating a bridge for this king, which now can go to g5 safely. And Komodo replied to this with b5, a very, very good move. Komodo needs to find some counterplay on the queen side, and in order to do that he needs to open some files. And the way to do that is to engage these queenside pawns as soon as possible. And now here after king f7, Komodo played bishop g2, attacking this pawn on b7. And if now Leela would play c6, then he could take and open the b5 for one of those rooks and get some counterplay. So that's why here Leela played rook b8, delaying opening up the files as much as possible by not pushing any of these pawns. And now the game continued with rook b1. Leela played b6 to defend the pawn. And now we have rook b4. Komodo still found a way to get to the pawns by playing rook c4 or rook a4 and attacking these two. And in this position, Leela would like to play here knight d5. The knight from d5 would not only defend this pawn on c7, but it would also allow this pawn to advance to f3, as we'll immediately see. So Leela played here rook h8, threatening to play h3 and trying to lure this bishop to the h3 square to block the pawn. But now Leela could play knight d5, and after the rook moves somewhere, she could get in f3 check. And taking that pawn would be losing after rook e8 check, since the king now has to step away from the rook, or Komodo would need to play here rook e3, but now black wins after rook f2, king d3, knight f4 check, king c2, and now Leela would take the rook on e3 because this bishop is pinned. But Komodo wasn't really impressed by Leela's h3 threat here. After all, his bishop is slicing this board in two and is guarding the queening square on h1. So he calmly played here rook c4, attacking this pawn on c7. And now after h3, he played bishop f3, and now Leela had to go back with the king to c8 and guard this pawn. But after king d3 and h2, Komodo now played rook a4, attacking this pawn on a7, and this pawn is very hard to defend. So Leela played here knight f5, and after rook takes on a7, she played king g6. And here Komodo continued with a4. He also wants a new queen, so he has to push those pawns up the board. And here Leela played knight h4, attacking white's superstar piece, this bishop on f3, which is blocking those pawns. And Komodo here saved his bishop with tempo by attacking this rook on c8. And now playing rook b8, trying to get this bishop, would backfire because of this bishop e4 check. And now after knight f5 or king h5, Leela would lose this pawn on c7 and quite possibly also the game. So after bishop b7, Leela preferred to play here rook e8. And now trying to get this pawn on c7 with tempo, with bishop e4 check, would be a terrible, terrible blunder by Komodo, because now Leela would get her chance to sack this rook for that bishop. And after king takes on e4, rook e6 check, king d3, and knight f3, black would be in trouble. Obviously, this knight cannot be taken because then this pawn promotes, and also the knight is threatening to get to g1 and cut the rook's view of h1 and help this pawn promote. So now the rook had to go to h1, and now after knight takes on d2, king takes on d2, Leela could play here f3, and this pawn is very hard to stop now. The king is also cut away. Komodo could try here rook a8, trying to get behind those pawns with the rook, but king g7 stops that. And now he could try a5, and after rook e2 check, king d3, and rook e1, attacking this rook, and if the rooks are exchanged, then this pawn promotes. He could play here a takes b6, a tricky move, because now if c takes on b6, then this rook gets back to a1 and white would be fine. But instead of taking that pawn, Leela could just simply take here on h1, and after b7 play c6, and this bishop is guarding the queening square and black wins. But Komodo, of course, is not today's chicken, and he wasn't keen on getting rid of his very powerful light-squared bishop. This bishop is the most powerful piece on the board right now, is Komodo's #1 defender. So he didn't go for this bishop e4 nonsense, but played a5. And now Leela took the pawn, the rook recaptured, and Leela here played a very beautiful move, rook f5. And it looks like the point could be maybe to pin this pawn to the rook and force the rook to defend the pawn, but more importantly, this rook now creates a second bridge for this king, which now could cross to g4 in safety. If Leela would start with the king, then after b6 check and b takes on c7, she would lose because this pawn would become a queen on c8. So after Leela's rook f5, Komodo continued here with bishop c6, attacking this other rook, and now Leela found another great move, rook b8, preventing this pawn to get to b6, very important in a variation that we'll see immediately. Leela is not afraid here of bishop e4, pinning and winning this rook on f5. She would be very happy to give up that rook after king g5. If now the bishop takes, then she could recapture with the knight, and there's no one left on this board that could stop the king to get to g2 and help Harry become a beautiful queen. And if after king g5 the bishop doesn't take, well, actually Komodo's best move in this position would be rook a7, attacking this pawn on c7, and now the power of rook b8 is revealed after rook f7 defending this pawn, because now there's no b6 taking advantage of the c7 pawn being pinned to the f7 rook, because now this rook could take on b6 and black would be winning. But after rook b8, Komodo preferred to play here bishop e1, attacking this bishop on g3, but after king g5 he didn't take the bishop, he went back with the bishop to d2. And now after king g4 he finally decided to pin this rook from behind. And Leela would like to see that trade happen, so she encouraged that with rook d8. But the bishop bluffed because he didn't take the rook, and now they started dancing a little bit back and forth here. And eventually, after some more moves, Leela got in f3. With this bishop not being on this diagonal, she could play now f3, and here Komodo played bishop e3, trying to set up a blockade now on the dark f2 square. And here, after a little more dancing, eventually Leela played here knight g2, attacking this bishop. And we see some more dancing now with bishop d2, knight back, and bishop e3. And now we switch back to the first pair, rook e8, bishop d7, rook d8, bishop e6, and finally Leela played king h3. She wants to play king g2 and help Harry become a queen. Trying to win a piece here with b6 by attacking this pinned rook on f5 doesn't work, because Leela could counterattack this rook on f1 and she would stand much better. So after king h3, Komodo preferred to play rook a2 and deny the g2 square from the king. And now Leela played rook f8, and her idea is quite simple. She wants to play knight g2 and take this bishop on e3, and then play f2 to shield the g2 square, play king g2 and queen harry. And to that idea, Komodo found an ingenious defense with rook h1, and after knight g2, he first took on f5 with check, and after rook takes on f5, he now played bishop g1, maintaining this bishop on this diagonal and guarding the f2 square. And the bishop is immune because of this pin on the rook. Absolutely ingenious. And it looks like that f2 might work here, but it doesn't, because now the rook could take on f2, and after bishop takes on f2, Komodo would have bishop takes on h2, threatening to win this pawn with a check. And if the bishop takes this pawn, then the game is even. Leela would be a knight up, but Komodo would have 3 pawns for it, and the game would be just a draw. Or alternatively, if the bishop would go now to g3, then Komodo could take the bishop, and after king takes, play rook h7, attack this pawn, and this pawn cannot be defended, and again Leela would have a knight for 3 pawns, and the game would be just even. So after bishop g1, instead of pushing f2, Leela played here rook f7, and she wants to go rook e7, and then get in with the rook and take that bishop. And to this, Komodo replied now with d5, and now we have knight f4 check, king e3, knight takes on d5, king d4, and knight back to f4, threatening knight e2 check and winning the bishop. So the bishop now took on h2, and now after knight d2 check, we have king e3, and bishop takes on h2, and Leela is now threatening to regroup and then push this pawn in. So Komodo found here the best defense, and that is to sack the rook for the knight and the pawn on f3. And now in the resulting ending, Leela has a bishop for a pawn, but she has to be very careful not to exchange her c7 pawn for any of the white pawns, because that would be only a draw. The game continued now with king g2, rook a1, and bishop g1. This bishop is guarding the b6 square and preventing this pawn maybe to advance and exchange itself for the c7 pawn. The bishop is guarding the c7 pawn also from this diagonal, but b6 might happen at some point in this case. So bishop g1, and now the game continued with king d3, bishop b6, king c4, rook f4 check, king b3, rook f5, c4, king f2, rook d1, king e3, and now rook d8. Leela made so much progress in this game. She managed to get an extra piece, this bishop on b6, but winning is still very difficult. The only winning plan in this position would be to get the king to c5 and attack this pawn on c4, the only pawn that actually can be attacked and won. But this king is so far away from the c5 square. As we can see, it's cut away because this rook is controlling the d file. So Leela's plan is then to advance this king up the board and try to persuade this rook to leave the control of the d file, and then somehow go to b7 and from there work itself up to the c5 square. Now let's see how Leela manages to do this. The game continued with king e4, rook d7, king e5, king b4, king e6, and in this position Komodo could play rook d3, let's say, and maintain the rook on the d file, but Leela would have bishop c5 check, and after king b3, bishop d6, shielding the king's path and allowing it to go to b7. So instead of that, after king e6, Komodo played here rook h7, but now Leela approaches the pawn, and now the game continued with rook h3, king d7, king c3, king c8, king c2, and now finally king b7, and step 2 is completed. What's coming now is trying to get the king to c5. The game continued now with king d3, bishop c5, king e4, rook g5, rook h1, and bishop d6, and just when the king has a clear path to c5, Komodo now stopped that idea with rook a1. King b6 now wouldn't be good, this would be only a draw, because after rook a6 check, king c5, and rook c6 check, Leela's king would need to go to b4, and this would allow now Komodo to play b6 and exchange Leela's final pawn, and then this would be only a draw. So after rook a1, Leela had to switch back to another plan, and she played here bishop c5, and if now rook a6 comes, then bishop b6 stops the rook from getting to c6. The game now continued with king d3, rook g3 check, king e4, rook g1, trying to exchange the rooks, because of course without the rooks, Leela's task would be super easy. Komodo rejects the offer, bishop b6, and now we have king d3 and rook g3, a very strong check, very important move, forcing this king to leave the defense of the c4 pawn. Both c3 and d4 are taking away from the king. And now if the king would try to defend that pawn with king e4 and after rook c3 go to king d5, then after c6 check he would still be forced to leave the defense of the c4 pawn, because if he would take here then he would lose this rook on a6. So after rook g3 check, instead of going to e4, Komodo preferred to play king d2, and the game continued with rook h3, king c2, rook f3, king d2, and now king c8. Maybe Leela is thinking about getting with the king to c5 like this, but after rook a1 and bishop c5, king c2, she played king b7. She changed her mind. But this is now a different position than before. Rook a6 trying to cut away the king and maybe go to c6 with the rook doesn't work, because in this position Leela would now have bishop e7 threatening to play rook f6 and exchange the rooks, and this would allow now this king to advance. And in this position actually best defense would be rook a1, and then after rook a3, rook e1, bishop d6, finally this king could advance to c5. The game could continue with rook f1, king b6, and now rook f5 trying to deny c5 from the king. But after rook e3, Leela would threaten again to play rook e5 and create a third bridge for that king. And after rook d5, rook e5, and rook d4, Leela would finally getting the winning king c5 move. After king b7, instead of rook a6, Komodo preferred to play rook h1, but it's all the same because Leela will still get in this king c5 move, thanks to this rook e3 and rook e5 bridging idea. King d2, rook e5, rook h1, king c5, and in this position now winning c4 is quite easy. Komodo goes here for b6, and after pawn takes, she attacks this pawn, and she would like to exchange b6 for c4, but of course that would be only a draw. So Leela plays here bishop c7, and now we have king d3. And the plan here, again, the winning plan is to separate the king from the c4 pawn. But this is not easy at all. Giving a check to the white king and in the same time maintaining this king on c5 is nearly impossible, with this rook harassing the black king from all sides. So the winning plan is then to actually install the bishop to c5 and have the bishop guard d4 and b4, and then hide with the king from the checks, give a check to the white king, separate it from the c4 pawn, and then come back with the king and finally win this pawn on c4. And this is now what we see on the board executed here. Leela is trying to dodge all the checks and install this bishop on c5. But of course it's not easy at all. Check, check, check. But eventually, after a couple of more moves here, finally the bishop gets to c5, taking away these squares from the king, and now Leela needs to get in a check with the rook and have c4 separated from his king. The game continued with rook h8. Now the king is trying to hide, and now after b7 the king could hide on a6, so the rook goes to h3 and tries to guard his king from a side check. But after rook f4, king d3, king a6, this king now is threatening to come to b4 and win this pawn this way, so the rook goes to h1, but this now allows a check, and finally after king e4 and rook c3, this king is separated from his pawn. It can go to d3, but as we'll see, that is only temporary. Now the king goes back to b7, and here comes rook d3 check, forcing the king for good away from the pawn. And now after king c6 is really easy. You just need to move the bishop away and pick up that pawn. And this is exactly what happens. The king is still cut away. Rook c2, king c5, king e7, and finally that pawn is won. And now the game continues with Leela advancing and promoting her b pawn. She's also giving up the bishop because she doesn't need it. And here now is really easy. This is an elementary rook endgame. And finally, about 15 moves later in this position, Leela gives the mate. This was an absolutely superb game. All the phases of it were very interesting and very instructive in my opinion. Please subscribe, like and share, and check out some of the other videos. Thanks for watching and see you soon. Bye bye.